The light came first. On the night of February 22, 1946, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were parked on a quiet road outside Texarkana when a flashlight struck the car window. Before the town had a nickname for the man outside, before newspapers turned him into the Phantom, before families began leaving lamps burning at dusk, there was only that beam of light, a gun, and a voice close to the glass. Later accounts describe the attacker wearing a light-colored mask, often said to be cloth or burlap, with rough openings cut for the eyes and mouth. It sounded crude rather than theatrical, the kind of thing a man could make quickly, pull over his face, and drop into the darkness when he no longer needed it. Hollis was struck with the gun. Larry was forced from the car and assaulted before she escaped and survived. Her survival reached the file in two ways. First, she was a young woman who got away from a man who had taken control of a lonely road. Then, only after the terror had passed into statement and memory, she became the one person who could tell police about the mask, the flashlight, the suddenness of the approach, and the blank space where a face should have been. The first officers had to build their account from fragments gathered after shock had already done its work. They had the car, the road, the side from which the man approached, the description of the mask, and the sound of the gun in a small, private space that had stopped being private the moment the light hit the glass. By morning, the place had settled back into ordinary daylight. Tire marks blurred with other tires. Trees looked harmless again. Dust covered what dust always covers. Texarkana was not a single neat room on a map. It lived across the Texas-Arkansas line, with people moving back and forth for work, errands, dances, family visits, school events, and the everyday business of a border town. A formal report might stay inside one office for a while, but a rumor could cross the state line before lunch. For a few weeks, the first attack remained a frightening local story. Parents warned daughters. Young couples thought twice before parking on back roads. Police had a survivor statement and a masked attacker, but the town could still cling to the hope that one terrible night might remain alone. On March 24, Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore took that comfort away. They were found in Griffin's car on another quiet road. There was no survivor this time, no frightened witness able to describe the man, no voice from inside the event. There was a vehicle, two victims, a rural scene, and gunshot evidence that moved the investigation into colder territory. The car had been a place to sit together in the dark. By daylight, it had become a murder scene. The work around the car had to be careful and physical. Deputies had to hold people back, while trying not to step across the few traces the night and the weather had left behind. They looked at the road surface, the vehicle, the positions, the marks, the evidence around the car, and the plain fact that the scene did not explain itself. Reports later described bloodstains on the ground that indicated the victims had been killed outside the car, and then placed back inside it. That single scene fact changed the shape of the night. It meant the car was not only where the bodies were found, it was part of something arranged after the shooting. The .32 caliber evidence did not give police a face. It gave them a point of comparison, the kind of hard object that could be held apart from rumor. In 1946, even a comparison moved slowly. Evidence passed through hands, envelopes, desks, typed reports, and offices. Men drove leads down roads rather than opening them on screens. A telephone call might start with a whisper and end with a patrol car, rolling toward a farmhouse, a garage, a gun counter, or a name that would fall apart by evening. Families did not receive the case in calibers and distances. They received it through the names Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, two people who had stepped out of ordinary rooms, and into a night that police were now trying to translate into diagrams, statements, and cautious official language. After Griffin and Moore, the first attack changed shape behind everyone's eyes. The flashlight, the mask, the young couple in a car, the isolated road, the gun. Details that had once belonged to one awful night now sat beside a double murder. Nobody needed to dress that in theory. The file had begun to answer with repetition. The newspapers gave the fear a name. Once the word phantom moved through town, it traveled faster than the evidence. It could be printed, repeated, whispered, and carried across kitchen tables. A nickname is clean. A police file is not. In the file there were shell casings, survivor accounts, map points, questions about weapons, and handwritten notes from people who had heard something, seen something, or wanted to believe they had. After dark, Texarkana began to look different. Porch lights stayed on longer. Gun counters grew busy, and words like locks, ammunition, and home protection slipped into ordinary conversation. Police cars moved through neighborhoods and down rural roads, their lamps washing over fences, porches, windshields, and the faces of people waiting for a sound that did not belong. The investigation drew help from beyond the local circle. Texas Rangers arrived, including Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzales, whose presence made the town feel watched by the wider world. Reporters came too, carrying cameras, notebooks, deadlines, and hunger for a story that was growing larger with every headline. They crowded the same places where officers needed quiet. The phones rang. Accusations came in. So did confessions, half-memories, neighbor grudges, and claims that sounded urgent until someone had to spend a day proving they were nothing. Then, on April 14, the case took Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. Betty Jo was 15, Paul was 16. She had played saxophone that night, and that detail has outlived many heavier words in the record because it brings back the life around the headline. A teenage girl, a club performance, an instrument case, and a ride home that never became a ride home. Paul's body was found first. Betty Jo's was found later, some distance away. The geography sent investigators into the same hard work of movement, where the car had been, where each victim was found, how far the killer may have walked or driven, how long the night had stayed empty before searchers and daylight began to close around the scene. The missing saxophone became a lead with a particular kind of ache. Officers asked pawn shops, musicians, friends, and anyone who handled instruments whether one had turned up. It was something a person might try to sell, hide, throw away, or keep for reasons that made sense only inside the killer's own choices. The instrument did not solve the murders. It stayed behind as part of Betty Jo's last ordinary evening, a piece of youth dragged into a file full of guns, roads, and statements. By then, the town was living inside the question of when another attack would come. Roads that had once promised privacy now felt exposed. Couples stopped trusting quiet places. Parents measured time by the sound of a car returning to the driveway. The same darkness that had always settled over Texarkana began to feel occupied. The reward money grew, and with it came more noise. Anonymous calls, tips about neighbors, stories about suspicious men, claims from people who wanted attention, and statements from people who may truly have seen something, all arrived through the same lines. Police could not throw the calls away. They could not trust them easily either. One might hold the small, ordinary fact that opened the case. Most only added another slip of paper to a desk already crowded with names. That spring, fear became visible in small domestic changes. Men sitting watch near homes, families pulling curtains, and stores selling weapons to people who had never expected to buy one. The sound of a slowing car after sundown could make a room go still. It was a town trying to protect itself while waiting for the law to turn a mask into a man. Then the case left the lovers' lanes. On May 3, Virgil and Katie Starks were at home at their farmhouse near Highway 67. The Starks attack remains one of the most troubling turns in the file because it moved the danger from parked cars into a private home. A house is supposed to be the place people run back to when the road feels unsafe. That night, the road came to the window. Virgil Starks was inside, reportedly reading a newspaper or listening to the radio, when he was shot through a window by someone outside. Glass broke inward. The room changed in an instant. Katie heard the shots and went toward the telephone, the one object in the house that could reach beyond the walls. She was shot too, but she survived. The telephone was not an image to her. It was help. It was the line out. In the middle of a room that had stopped being shelter, she tried to reach another human being. Accounts describe her escaping and reaching a neighbor for help. The neighbor's house became what her own house no longer was. A place where the night did not belong entirely to the attacker. The Starks scene left investigators with a harder question than the public wanted. The timing and fear seemed to pull it toward the earlier attacks, but the reported weapon was different. A .22 rather than the .32 evidence tied to the March and April murders. That difference sat in the file and refused to disappear. It left room for more than one possibility. The same killer changing weapons, a related but separate attack, or a frightened town trying to place every new terror under the same name. Officers had to work from the window outward, through the angle of the shot, the broken glass, the room inside, the ground outside, the roads by which someone could arrive and leave, and Katie Stark's surviving account gave the day case a new kind of dread, and at the same time, it made the pattern less clean. It widened the story just when investigators needed it to narrow. By May, even the scenes themselves were no longer private. Later accounts describe officers being drawn toward strange lights at the Starks' farmhouse and finding not the killer, but investigators and a reporter taking flash photographs around the property. Flashbulbs at a farmhouse window belong to the strange afterlife of this case. Part police work, part media hunger, part public spectacle. Everyone wanted a piece of the answer, and the answer still would not stand still. The leads came in waves. One involved Henry Booker, Duty, Tennyson, a young man who died by suicide years later and left a note that appeared to claim responsibility for some of the crimes. A confession after death has a terrible neatness. It cannot be pushed, interrupted, tested under pressure, or made to answer for details that do not match. Police could compare the words to the known facts, then leave the claim where the evidence allowed it to rest. Other stories reached for strangers: an escaped prisoner of war, a dangerous hitchhiker, a man passing through. Those stories placed the danger outside familiar circles, which must have been easier for some people to bear. If the killer had only drifted through Texarkana, then perhaps the town had not produced him. But an easier answer is still only an answer if evidence can carry it. The missing saxophone sent officers through another set of doors. They moved through shops, musicians, people who might know instruments, and people who might have heard somebody trying to sell one too quickly. It remained a lead because it was real enough to search for, and painful because it belonged to a girl whose final evening had already been broken into distances and evidence. Every false lead cost something. A patrol car sent out, a man interviewed, a claim checked against details held back from the newspapers, a gun rumor followed to its owner. or a confession tested for the small facts a liar would not know unless someone had fed them to him. When the lead failed, the case did not return fresh to the table. It came back with another day gone. Then the strongest name moved into the center of the file. U.L. Swinney was already known to law enforcement as a car thief and counterfeiter. That background mattered in Texarkana, because the case had always moved through vehicles. Cars had been hiding places, scenes, escape tools, and dead ends. Arkansas investigator Max Tackett noticed a stolen car pattern around the murders. Vehicles taken, vehicles abandoned, and movement that did not feel accidental. A stakeout of a reported stolen car on the Arkansas side led police to Peggy Swinney, described in later accounts as U.L. Swinney's girlfriend, and later his wife. That moment gave the investigation something it had not had before. A name with weight behind it. Not a rumor passed over a counter. Not a stranger seen from the corner of an eye. A man already close to stolen cars, already known to police, already moving in the kind of criminal world where false names and abandoned vehicles could keep a person just ahead of consequences. Then Peggy began to talk. Later accounts say she gave law enforcement details that interested them because some appeared to reach beyond what the public had been told. An interview room can change when that happens. The pencil slows. The questions become more careful. Officers who have listened to too many empty claims begin listening for the small things: an object, a route, a place where something was left, a sequence that sounds too close to the file to dismiss. The case seemed, for a moment, to step out of legend and into a room with chairs, paper, ashtrays, and names. After months of masks and roads and headlights, investigators had a suspect they could hold on paper and in custody. They had stolen car records. They had Peggy's words. They had the sickening possibility that the man they had been hunting might finally be close enough to question. Then the near answer began to break apart. U.L. Swinney did not give police a clean murder confession. No weapon settled the case. No survivor placed his face behind the mask. The pressure depended heavily on Peggy, and Peggy's account did not stay steady. She changed parts of her story. Then she married him. A marriage certificate is a quiet object. It does not look like a door closing. In the Swinney file, it helped make one close. The witness who had brought police closest to the private center of the case became the witness prosecutors could not safely force into place. The paper did not erase suspicion. It weakened the path by which suspicion could become a murder trial. That is the ache of the Swinney folder. Investigators were not left with nothing. They were left with stolen cars, a suspect already in custody for other crimes, a woman whose statements had pulled them toward him, and enough circumstantial weight for his name to stay in the case for decades. What they lacked was the last legal bridge, a stable witness, a confession that could carry itself, physical evidence that would stand in court, or a public trial where all of it could be tested. Swinney went to prison for other offenses, including car theft. Texarkana never got a murder conviction read aloud in open court. The families never heard a verdict attach his name to the deaths of Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, or Virgil Starks. The town did not get the hard ending it had been waiting for, since the first flashlight hit the first car window. So Swinney remains in the story with a difficult kind of weight. He is not legally the phantom killer. He was never convicted of these murders. Still, his file has the shape of the answer Texarkana almost had, close enough that investigators and later writers kept returning to it, broken enough that the law could not close the case around him. After Swinney, other names could still be raised. Old cases attract names the way old houses gather dust in corners. Some suspects looked interesting for a while. Some stories fit one piece of the file and failed another. Some people wanted the answer to be an outsider, because an outsider can be imagined leaving town. Some wanted it to be Swinney, because his file seemed to explain more than any other. The evidence never gave Texarkana a result strong enough to survive the distance between suspicion and judgment. Over the years, the murders became larger and less exact than the case itself. The 1976 film The Town That Dreaded Sundown carried the story into popular culture, and for many people outside Texarkana, the movie became the version they remembered. The real file was less tidy. It had survivors and dead ends, firearm questions, and changing statements. A farmhouse that complicated the pattern, and a suspect folder that never became a conviction. The case stayed unsolved for reasons that were painfully practical. The scenes were dark and rural. The attacker used masks, surprise, and vulnerable places. Witnesses saw only fragments, often through terror, headlights, injury, or distance. Publicity fed police both help and garbage. The Starks attack widened the pattern instead of cleaning it up. The strongest information around Swinney leaned on testimony that would not hold steady enough for court. And the tools of 1946 were paper, memory, telephone wires, road checks, gun records, interviews, and men trying to keep a town from tearing itself apart while the phones kept ringing. Time worked on the file in its own slow way. Witnesses aged, officers retired. Families carried questions into decades that offered no new answer. Roads changed. Newspapers yellowed. The panic became history, then legend, then film, then a cold case that people still return to because it feels unfinished in a way the mind resists. The records hold what they can. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry at the car window. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore on a quiet road. Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, with the saxophone missing from the last normal hours of the night. Virgil and Katie Starks inside a farmhouse that should have been safe. The .32 evidence. The .22 question. The phones. The patrols. The gun counters. The stolen car trail. Peggy Swinney's shifting statements. Ewell Swinney's name staying in the room even after the courtroom door closed. The phantom never became a man the law could name. There were details. There were survivors. There were suspects, rumors, weapons questions, newspaper pages, and a town full of people listening for cars after dark. There was enough to keep investigators, writers, and families circling the same roads for generations. There was never the last piece. And so the story returns to light. A flashlight at a car window. Headlights on rural roads. Porch lamps left burning longer than they used to. A farmhouse window breaking inward. Police lamps moving over ground that would not give back enough. Somewhere beyond all that light, the answer stayed out of reach.